This is the second part of my loving critique of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, a game with many faults which I nonetheless adore. Even though this should work standalone, I recommend you start on the first part of the series. This video contains spoilers up through the end of Chapter 2 and brief allusions without any specific details to stuff that happens in Chapter 4. Chapter 2 of Xenoblade 2 is where the game properly gets started, and probably the longest video in this series. There's 5 billion tutorials to discuss and a bunch of character introductions, so this video will be unusually dense for this series. Let's get on with it, it's long enough as it is. As we start Chapter 2, we're presented with a cutscene involving Bana and Pupunen. Pupunen tells Bana about what happened near the end of Chapter 1, and Bana decides that with the tides the way they are, our party will probably end up in Gormott. As he does this, really ominous music starts, which seems to tell us that Gormott is a scary place, but it's just an instance of slightly misplaced music giving off a wrong impression.
Still, how interesting. Heading southward from Cyclus Sea. In current season, that likely take them to Gormott.
What's actually happening here is that they want this piece to be playing over the actually ominous conversation Bana is about to have with Dughall, but they need to start it early to sync it up well. On a first playthrough, it's easy to forget about it by the time you're properly introduced to Gormott and realize it's not as scary as the music is telling you, but on repeat playthroughs it comes across incredibly cheap and janky. It's just one of the ways the game's presentation feels a little unpolished. As Bana talks to Dughall, it becomes clear that Dughall is an agent of the Empire of Morardain, who's been helping Bana steal core crystals from Morardain for profit, and that the two are worried about Indal catching wind of this. These are all terms we'll learn more about soon in the story, and they're well placed. The general gist of all of them is immediately clear. Morardain is a nation that controls Gormott, core crystals are something valuable, Indal is an entity capable of bringing about punishment for this crime. So the scene is comprehensible in the moment, but they're also not over-explained and leave more things to learn about as the game goes on. I want to specifically flag up the fact that Dughall is stealing from Morardain though, as it'll be important all the way in Chapter 4. We cut back to Rex as the camera's having another close encounter with Pyra's breasts. This one at least has plausible deniability, being a first-person shot as Rex wakes up on Pyra's lap, and it's arguable that this is where he starts realizing he's attracted to her, but we all know why they chose to make this a first-person shot, and why they decided to put Rex on Pyra's lap in the first place, right? It's just tacky. Nowhere near as bad as the shot where we're first introduced to Pyra in Chapter 1, but tacky nonetheless. They talk for a little bit, decide to go find the others, and we get our tutorial for the Affinity Chart and weapon art leveling systems. This one's fine. They're both simple systems, so anyone who's played a JRPG before won't have trouble following it, and it's easy enough to figure the systems out by just clicking around in the menus. My problem is more with the system themselves, specifically the Affinity Chart, which is essentially pointless. It's mostly incredibly minor bonuses that take way too long to unlock. There's a few nodes on each character's Affinity Chart that are pretty much required. The ability to use arts at the start of combat really speeds up the early game, art cancelling is pretty much obligatory, and for a few characters there's an important ability that helps them be able to properly function, like Nia's break chance up. This seems like a good thing until you realize that the rest of the bonuses are so minor that the only reasonable way to level through the Affinity Chart is to dump absolutely all of your points into either the important skills or the skill nodes that are required to unlock them, meaning there's not actually that much choice. This would work almost as well as it does if your Affinity Chart just leveled automatically. Weapon art leveling is a lot more interesting though. You can dump points into the arts using combat for each weapon you have, as well as choose 3 out of the 4 arts available to bring into combat. For now, each character only has one weapon type, but that's about to change pretty quickly, and as such there's decisions to be made. You'll probably want to level each character's main weapon arts as a priority since they'll be using them a lot, but you'll be able to equip 2 more weapons, and you want to level those too. You also have to decide what art to not have equipped for each weapon, what arts are most important for each weapon type, or even whether you want to save WP for weapons you might get in the future that will be important for your team. It's a pretty simple leveling system, but it's got enough depth to justify existing, and considering how many different systems will end up by the end of Chapter 4, it's good that this one isn't too involved. The same tutorial gives you a stats rundown. This is actually surprisingly well explained for this game. There's a few more nuances to a couple of the stats, but it would bog it down too much, and what's here is all accurate, which is more than you can say for some of these tutorials. The problem is that this is the only place in the game where this is explained, and there's no way to access it once you close this text box. If, like me, you play tons of these JRPGs where all of these stat names are regularly used and do slightly different things, it's easy to lose track and get confused between, say, dexterity and agility. In fact, I'm going to not put it on screen and ask you this. Which one of those two is your chance to dodge, and which one is your chance to hit? What exactly does luck do in combat? Hint, it's not your chance to crit. Seeing as you're not going to need to min-max your build for at least another 100 hours of gameplay, it's really easy to forget this stuff by then, and there's no in-game way to check it when it does become relevant. You can always go to the wiki, but you shouldn't need to rely on external sources like that. Tired of tutorials yet? So am I! I'm 1000 words into the script and we've not yet moved our character. Thankfully, the game lets us run a grand total 32 meters towards our objective with no possibility for combat or exploration on the way before stopping us for another tutorial. It's good that it at least lets us try out the leveling it just told us about before bombarding us with more information, but do you see why people don't absorb any of this information yet? It's so much, so quickly, and it's often pretty poorly explained. Now we have the blade leveling tutorial, which pretty much works like the driver affinity chart, but instead of putting points in, you do have to do small tasks out in the world with the blade equipped to unlock the nodes. Like here, to unlock Pyra's level 1 Purifying Flames, I have to use 3 blade arts. Other types of tasks will be hunting specific monsters, finding landmarks, using specific abilities in combat, or doing weird things like jumping 600 times. It's a cool little system that encourages varied gameplay and keeps things fresh throughout. No complaints here. I do wish the tutorial told you that for the node to actually unlock and give its effect, you have to visit the menu after getting the notification that it's unlocked though. I think Chugga Conroy might have warned about this in his Let's Play, but I still managed to forget about it by the time I played the game, and I spent a decent chunk of my first playthrough with blades who weren't using all the abilities I'd earned. There's also core chips. These are just a fancy way of saying weapons. Each blade uses one which powers up the weapon they hit with, and the only thing distinguishing them from weapons in other games is that they transform into whatever weapon type the blade uses, and you can't unequip them. If you use one on a blade, you can only ever overwrite it with a better one. Well, I guess a worse one if you want to, but why would you? After this, we're finally set free to actually play the game proper and experience the story further. The area we find ourselves in is actually a subzone of Gormott known as Lower Gormott, with a different look and feel from Gormott proper. It's used 1 or 2 times outside this bit of the story in Sidequests, but it's clearly mainly intended to be here for this, and I love it. It's got a distinctive personality to it, and it's linear enough to funnel you through all the plot beats it needs to hit while still allowing for a little bit of exploration. The fact that this music isn't used outside of here is a crying shame too. It would really fit a bigger, mellower zone, but it does also allow for that big wow moment once we're finally let out into Gormott proper. We walk a bit, fight a couple of enemies, and find Gramps. He was badly hurt in the battle at the end of chapter 1, and after a few heartfelt words with Rex, he dies. This is a well-made cutscene that's emotionally effective. It communicates Gramps' bond with Rex well, and Rex is properly devastated. It really does a great job of tugging at the heartstrings, and it's also the first of a select few cutscenes in this game that I despise with all my heart, because Gramps immediately resurrects as this cute imp thing, and the entire thing is played off for laughs in an extended anime shenanigans comedy scene straight out of like Azumanga Daioh or something. This would be fine if the moments before that made it obvious that this was going to be a comedy scene, but it is actually played off as a serious moment. It's clearly meant to make you feel sad, and it's undercut in a very cheap way. It doesn't just feel bad in the moment, it cheapens the entire rest of the game as well. This is the game effectively telling you you're dumb if you're sad about a character dying. Death doesn't matter in this game. Which is very odd, because there are several instances of character death in this game that are played for drama and heartbreak, but I just straight up didn't believe the game the first time it killed a character off for real after this, because this cutscene is such a loud declaration that the game thinks you're silly for caring about character death. I don't understand why this cutscene is the way it is. It's definitely not the only possible way to transform Gramps into his imp form, and it has such an adverse effect on the way you perceive the game's storytelling priorities that it really feels like I'm missing something, but I just think this is straight up a mistake. We keep going down the path and we get our collection point tutorial. I'll talk about these later since this video is already going to be way longer than I want it to be. Shortly after, we encounter our first field skill check along with the field skill tutorial. Oh boy, I'll sure have more to say about these in a future video. Field skills. Oh man. We continue down the path and run into Nia and Dromark fighting some Brogs, which prompts one of the better combat tutorials in the game. It explains the party gauge, which for now is just a way to resurrect allies, and it goes into blade combos. It does the thing I criticized early in Chapter 1, where it fills your special gauge for you, but it's actually not that bad this time, because it's trying to get you to actually use a blade combo rather than teaching about specials themselves, so it's enabling you to actually use the mechanics it's teaching you, as opposed to the special tutorial which just forced you to not use it. It's a decent tutorial. It explains that each blade has an element, that using a special inflicts that element as a cooldown on the enemy, and that by using a higher level special of a different element, indicated by the combo tree on the top right of the screen, you can progress a blade combo, causing higher damage with your specials and inflicting specific effects on the enemy. This is the point where combat becomes bearable, as you're now actually managing things. You're trying to build a special in time to be able to combo before the blade combo gauge runs out. It's still a little simplistic and slow paced, but it's not just mindlessly auto-attacking and then activating arts off cooldown anymore. You're sometimes building up special preemptively before activating the next special to try and get a little more time out of that gauge. It's a little more thinking and a little less just pressing buttons. We get a pretty decent cutscene. Nia is nice and grateful, which is a nice contrast to her prickly exterior in Chapter 1. Rex is weirdly protective of Pyra, which will be set up for growth later, and Gramps and Pyra are implied to have backstory together, which will turn out to not be that important and sort of inconsistent with what we actually see on screen later, but it's at least nice mystery and setup. It's short and sweet, and we're soon left to play more of the game, and man, cool, I get to control Nia! I've been playing as Rex for so long, I'm raring to try her out. She looks like an agile cat person, probably fast attack speed, that's dope! Oh, she rides on Dromark, that's brilliant! Let's fight an enemy, let's see how she plays. Oh, she's got cool twin rings, that's badass! And the enemy dies before we get to fire off a single art as Nia. This is a big problem. It leaves just the absolute worst impression of the game. I think people having this experience is as big a factor as to why Xenoblade 2's combat system is seen as slow by so many people as that awful first tutorial back in Chapter 1. If you switch to Nia here, which lots of players will want to do, it's a new character after all, you actually just straight up don't get to participate in fights against the monsters in the area. Especially if you're not aware of stutter stepping, which is where you repeatedly nudge the control stick to reset your auto-attack combo and repeatedly use the first auto-attack to speed up arts recharges, which is a possibly unintended technique that the game definitely never tells you about. There's absolutely no reason this experience should be this way. If you as a developer don't want to tweak Nia's power level at all, the monster should actually have more health, because you should be able to at least use arts as Nia at this point. It would effectively slow the pace of combat down, yes, but it would also make it feel faster because you're interacting with it. You're doing things, you're building towards something. As is, in this fight I wasn't even halfway to being able to use an art before the enemy died. This would have played out exactly the same if I left the controller unsupervised and went to make a sandwich. But why shouldn't you tweak Nia's power level? Arts recharge improves as you level them, so if you want Nia's endgame recharges to be the same speed, you just have to improve them less when you level. Nia generally, and Nia using Dromark specifically, is already one of the least, if not the least useful party member over the course of the game, and having her be just a tiny bit quicker at using arts in the early game wouldn't tip the balance. You could frankly just slightly buff her recharge across the board, even in the late game, and she probably still wouldn't see play on most optimized endgame parties, because the other party members are mostly just better than Nia. What you can't possibly do is create a moment this bad. This is a quit moment. It makes the combat system look and feel unplayably terrible. There's no excuse here. The feeling of switching to Nia only to have her be completely unusable in combat is possibly the low point of the entire game. Horrible first impression, horrible gameplay, and horrible execution. It might seem like I'm kicking up a storm over nothing, but if you think that, I think you underestimate how important first impressions are. Xenoblade 2 eventually gets to have a blazingly fast combat system full of decisions, yet it's known for its combat being slow and as molasses and uninteractive because of truly unforgivable shit like this. The game will continue to struggle to introduce new characters to the party without making a bad first impression in gameplay, but Nia takes the cake. There's a weird repeat of a field skills tutorial that gives you a chest that you can't open, and it amounts to, hey, you can fail them. Even though the first field skill tutorial sort of implied that, and we got taught that organically when we failed in a very similar way back on Argentum during that hide and seek quest that I praised for wordlessly teaching you this. And then we finally make it out of Lower Gormott. I like Lower Gormott, but for the purposes of this series it was hell. It's so dense with tutorials and there's so much to talk about.
Oh my goodness, what a wonderful view.
Spectacular indeed.
The first impression of Gormott proper is fantastic. This is the Bionis lag, aka Gower Field, aka Gower Plain of Xenoblade 2, and it has a similar effect to being let out of that ravine after Tephra Cave. It's the first time you're just let loose on a big, open area to explore as you desire. It's gorgeous and the music is great and it feels so vast and freeing. I'm not going to go into the design of Gormott as a zone in this video because God knows it's already way too dense with all the tutorials we just got through, and we'll keep going through, but it's also a really well designed zone. Unfortunately, on my first playthrough immediately after this there was almost a quit moment because, man, the game can look like garbage sometimes. To fit all of these fantastic zones with insane detail on screen, the game has to look incredibly blurry at times, and when you've been a PC gamer for most of your life and this is one of your first experiences on the pretty underpowered Switch, it feels like a joke. Look at the amount of detail we're losing on Nia's face and how blurry the background is. Maybe this is just a me thing. Maybe people who've grown up on consoles are more used to seeing corners cut this way, but to me at the time it really just felt like I was looking at the game world through a lens covered in Vaseline. Unlike everything else I've criticized though, I think this is the right choice, and it is just a me issue. It's shockingly easy to get used to this. Within an hour of playtime I wasn't noticing it anymore, and by showing this much stuff on screen the game both encourages exploration in a big way and really gives the impression of the world being huge and vast and beautiful. It's 1,000,000% the right decision, and it gives the game so much of its character and charm. I know there isn't, but I just wish there was a way to mitigate that. Wait, this is really the amount of blur we're looking at? Type of moment, because it honestly hit me like a train the first time through. I'm glad they made the right decision though. I would have a million blurry Gormotts rather than one clear corridor sequence. The first wander through Gormott is fantastic, partially through the way the game shows you its philosophy of monster levels, namely that it doesn't really control for them. The first thing you see once you make it off the little viewing platform that you start on is a pack of Ferris that are too high level for you, including a very prominently placed and intimidating unique monster. I actually accidentally died to these Ferris. Later on the path towards Torigoth, you'll encounter Territorial Rotbart, a level 80 unique monster who runs around unpredictably and who will attack you in sight and likely one-hit kill you. He's an iconic staple of the Xenoblade series at this point, designed to teach you that there's stuff out there that you can't immediately fight. If you were to venture off into the wilds, you'd come across monsters in the level 40s, but there's still goodies to be found. In his Let's Play, Chugga Conroy cleverly dodges a bunch of high-level monsters and opens up a chest that contains a core chip that's intended for considerably later in the game, giving him a big head start in terms of power. It's a super cool way of doing things. It makes exploration way more engaging as you're constantly probing for areas that you're prepared for. It gives it a slight risk-reward aspect as well, by making you think about risking fights with enemies that you're slightly underleveled for but might defeat. And it makes truly powerful rewards available to clever and skilled players to earn by outsmarting the game or powering through challenging fights. It also makes the leveling process feel incredibly rewarding, since as you level up, more and more of the world opens up to you, challenges that were impossible earlier become doable, and you're able to take revenge on monsters that gave you grief before. I think it's just an agreed upon fact that one of the best parts of every single Xenoblade game is going back to the starting zone at a high level and finally killing Territorial Rotbart, who probably killed you when you were starting out and who's almost certainly jump scared you by suddenly aggroing onto your low level party when you didn't expect him to. We come across a side quest in the wild. It's literally just fighting a few monsters that are attacking a merchant. I guess it's neat how organic this feels, but I forgot the side quest existed. After that, there's a tutorial for the Tides system, where parts of the world will be inaccessible depending on the tide of the Cloud Sea. This is cool in theory, but it's basically a non-system. I think I had to change the tide less than 5 times in my entire 100% playthrough. As we make it into Torigoth, there's a very anime comedy scene of Nia getting upset about the picture on her wanted poster. I skipped over the first anime comedy scene of the game earlier when Gramps revealed he wasn't dead in order to complain about it more, but there's a lot of this, and I actually sort of like it about this game. It's a very contentious point, and I understand why. It's quite a clash with a lot of the more serious moments, and it's lowbrow in a way that Xenoblade 1 never was. But I like it when long stories have dissonant tones like this. It's more believable to me when the characters' lives aren't just full of moments of one tone, there's also goofy moments of levity in there. I think it makes it feel more real, like the tragic moments feel like they're happening to real people who are capable of doing silly, stupid things instead of serious characters whose lives are constantly full of respectable drama. I think this is an issue of personal taste though, and I see how the more coherent tone of something like Xenoblade 1 could work better for people. I don't necessarily think either approach is better than the other, I just think I personally prefer this one. Not all of the anime comedy scenes work, though. There's a few that I'm going to criticize pretty heavily, including one in this chapter. It's worth noting that both here and when we first stepped out of Lower Gormott, Nia has still been vocally loyal to the other members of Tora, intending to dump Rex and company to go rejoin them, despite them trying to kill her at the end of the previous chapter. This is mixed in effectiveness. The game's trying to tell us that Nia doesn't have any other place to go, and that is an important part of her character that's effectively communicated here, but Malos did actually literally attempt to murder Nia last chapter, and realistically no amount of loneliness would make her either want to go back or be able to reasonably think she can go back. Maybe if Nia hadn't joined in on the fight with Malos actively and had simply helped Rex escape without ever actually fighting the other Tora members, this would work better. But as is, it's another clumsy story point that makes the game feel just slightly off, like it's something that should be a little bit different to work. We then run into one of the more important cutscenes of the game lore-wise, the first explanation of blades. It's a really good lore dump. It's got effective dramatic tension thanks to its little story, where a meek older brother feels the need to risk his life to be able to feed his family that it combines with seamless exposition. These Ardanian soldiers have that core crystal thing that Bana and Dughall were talking about earlier. They keep talking about those driver and blade things that came up before, all the way back in chapter 1, and apparently if someone who can't be a driver touches the crystal, they fucking explode, and aha, core crystals become blades when a driver touches them. It's a little weird that Rex doesn't know this thing that seems to be very much common knowledge in Orust, especially since we've been told that Gramps taught him driver arts, so you'd think he would have taught him what a driver is as well, but it works for the audience. My one complaint is that it's never made clear if the guy who exploded when trying to resonate with the crystal died or just got badly injured. There's an instance of a character not dying from a failed resonance soon, but it seems to be framed as an exception, and I think the knowledge that all drivers have risked death to resonate with a core crystal would be an important thing to establish firmly. It would say a lot about the types of people who become drivers, which is a large part of the cast. We go into an alley to get around the crowd, and we have our first encounter with Brigid, the strongest blade in the Empire, so strong that she can beat us even without her driver nearby. She apparently wants to capture Pyra. This is cool. She's a badass, she's really well introduced to be intimidating, and I love her character design so much. The sound mixing in some of these cutscenes is way off though. I can barely hear her speak.
Just when I thought I could enjoy a little peace and quiet.
Brigid? Is she a blade? Where's her driver?
My driver is otherwise engaged at present. I am here alone.
As we fight her, we get a cancel attack tutorial. It's a simple enough mechanic that they can't really mess it up. You just press the art button at the right time to do more damage. And for some reason we get a repeat of the blade combo tutorial that doesn't add anything new. Not sure why that's there, but it sure is. It's not like we're having enough fucking tutorials this chapter. We win the fight with Bridget in gameplay, and then we lose it in a cutscene, annoying. Nia and Dromart get captured, and Rex and Pyra are saved by a mysterious Nopon dousing Bridget in water and making it hard for her to summon her flames. We soon learn he's called Tora, and he makes a fantastic first impression. He's humble, soft-spoken, and super earnest, while still seeming smart. He seems to honestly like the things he likes, and he's open about his admiration for drivers like Rex. I'm about to commit heresy here. I'm not a big fan of Ricky, the Nopon party member from the first game. He's admittedly got some truly great moments where his facade drops and he acts like a wise father figure for the party, which is what he really is. But mostly he's portrayed as a comically loud, self-aggrandizing, annoying dumbass, and I find him pretty irritating for most of his time on screen. Tora is a great contrast to that. He seems like a genuine guy with a lot of passion for what he does and a heartfelt desire to do good, while still having the amusing characteristics shared by most Nopon that make him a natural fit for a comic relief role. His voice actor is really good at capturing that aspect of his character too. He's shockingly soft-spoken for a Nopon, and he just comes across as a likeable dude all around. It also helps that his house is an immaculate vibe. Just look at it. There's a brief comedy scene with Dughall and Captain Padraig, who just failed to apprehend us in the alley fight. It's amusing enough, and it sells these two characters' incompetence well. I would normally just completely skip over it, since it doesn't really matter, but I think this is the first bit of voice acting that I really love in this game. Padraig's performance here is immaculate. He really captures the awkwardness and confusion of the moment, and you can hear him struggling to contain nervous laughter as he asks questions he knows sound dumb.
I'm not exactly sure what colour emerald is supposed to be.
Oh, give me strength! It's green, you idiot! Emerald is green! Like this! Green! Get it, ya clod?
Oh, green! I get it now. So, emeralds are green. Huh.
It's the perfect balance of funny and believable, and it really elevates what's otherwise a really forgettable and frankly completely unimportant scene. It's just a great job. Also, I love and believe the fan theory that Padraig is colorblind. It just makes so much sense. This scene immediately cuts into the introduction of Morag, the Imperial Special Inquisitor, and I love how intimidating and villainous this introduction is. This is the sort of introduction you get for Darth Vader. Her presence is immediately towering over all of the incompetent buffoons we've just watched do comedic shenanigans, and she instantly commands respect and authority. She's just a joy to watch on screen. It's impossible to take your eyes off her as she effortlessly proves how much more competent and well put together she is than everyone around her. She's such an absolute badass, and she's got such a brilliant character design. I love Morag to death, and I will be gushing about her a lot. Unfortunately, once everything is said and done, this is sort of an overlong cutscene. It keeps cutting between the Imperial side and Rex and company plotting to rescue Nia, and to be honest, nothing is really achieved plot-wise. We could have just had Rex say he wants to rescue Nia, and Morag say she wants to capture Pyra, and been done with it. But there's like this dinner scene where Pyra establishes she can cook, and then she asks Cage about her powers, and then this interrogation scene, and really not much is actually achieved with all of this. It's not like unpleasant to watch or anything, but I just can't help but feel like we're spinning our wheels and we could be getting through this faster. We're finally set loose on Torigoth, and man, I just love this town. It might seriously be my favourite town in any JRPG. I can't think of anything I like more off the top of my head, and a lot of that is down to this music. Have a listen. That's the night theme of Torigoth, and I think it's simply phenomenal. You can feel how good the people of Torigoth are in that guitar. It gives off the perfect feeling of a rural, simple, but still busy and bustling lively town resting for the night. The day theme captures the hustle and the bustle better, but it still has that warm overtone. Torigoth itself is gorgeous, and it's creatively designed with this big ravine in the middle with docks on either side which you can explore vertically to find a bunch of stuff tucked away. It feels dense and busy while still being homely and warm. There's just few enough NPCs in the town that you can get to know them and learn their stories as the game goes on, but enough to make it feel like a big town. In my opinion, it's both the prettiest and the most real feeling settlement in the game. It's a personal thing, but I just can't help but feel happy when I'm in Torigoth, and I think the few hours of gameplay that center around here if you're doing side quests is what got me to finally buy fully into the game and stop doubting whether I wanted to keep playing it on my first playthrough. After asking around town, we're eventually led to the Blade Awakening tutorial. Oh boy, I thought I'd spoken in depth about enough systems, but this chapter won't ever let me end the video, I don't think. As you go through the game, you'll collect core crystals from various sources. You can awaken these core crystals on a specific playable character called a driver to obtain a blade. Blades come in two flavors, common and rare. Common blades are randomly generated, and will be what you're mostly opening. They always have this sort of mecha-human or mecha-canine if they're Twinger users design, and they come with random weapons, elements, and abilities. They can be pretty strong in their own right, as they might randomize into some really strong abilities, and they offer every character easy access to almost every weapon type, which is important because some characters have really good arts for specific weapons and you don't want to miss out on those. In fact, on my first playthrough, I had Rex equipped with a common Chromakatana blade all the way until chapter 6, because his Chromakatana set is really strong and the abilities I rolled on it were really good. Rare blades, however, are the real stars of the system. As the name implies, they're a pretty rare drop when awakening core crystals. All of them are uniquely designed blades with specific looks created by a bunch of guest artists. Most of them share weapon types with common blades, but all of them have unique skills, which means they can be pretty powerful in ways that common blades can't access, and they thus have access to unique playstyles. On top of that, each rare blade comes with a unique, fully voice-acted blade quest, where you get to learn about them as a character, and a unique heart-to-heart, which we'll learn about later in this chapter. This means that optional story content is actually gated behind randomly pulling rare blades, and if you want to see all of the content in the game, you're forced to open a lot of core crystals. There's no way of guaranteeing rare blades out of your core crystal pulls for the most part, so there's an element of luck involved. It's effectively a gacha system, though there's no way to pay real money for the crystals outside the stuff you get as a bonus if you buy the expansion, so it's not predatory in the way gacha usually is. You're not going to be spending lots of money trying to pull the thing you want, and you'd have to be pretty insane to buy the expansion just to get a handful of bonus core crystals. You're probably buying it for the actual expansion, you know? This is an incredibly controversial system, and I get it. It feels bad to have to roll for this stuff, and it's got that dreaded loot box feel to it where you can spend time trying to get something and never getting anything good. But I still actually really like it. As I've mentioned, my first playthrough of the game was 100%, and this included all the blade quests, meaning I had to get every rare blade. I got almost all of them by just completing the game normally, with no grinding, and I managed to open the 3 I was missing after just an hour of post-game grinding. Keep in mind, the hour of grinding was to play in a way that's really not intended. You're not meant to 100% the game on one playthrough, it's designed with New Game Plus in mind, and I really don't think they intend all players to get all their blades over one playthrough. So the system's pretty darn generous, and it's grind-free, and most importantly, it has a really positive effect on gameplay. By not giving you free access to all the tools you want, the game forces you to build around what you pull. On my first playthrough, I got a bunch of blades that boosted their damage under specific risky circumstances early into the game, meaning I wound up building a really aggressive team that focused on getting damage boosts by doing weird things that don't really help early in fights. That meant I'd usually be playing suboptimally and I fell behind, but I was then able to counterattack at insanely high damage late in the fight and finish the enemies off before they could finish me off, leading to an incredibly distinct playstyle. Because blades are so varied and have such variety in what they can do, the blade resonance system means you're forced to be creative with how you outfit your characters, looking for unexpected synergies, and searching through randomly generated blades for abilities that fill the gaps in your rare blades powers. I'm very excited to see where my team goes on this playthrough, where by being less thorough with sidequests I'll get less crystals and be forced to play with more limited tools, building a team that will be distinctly mine. It's a similar feeling to Pokemon Nuzlocke, where the limitation on your encounters forces you to use stuff you wouldn't use if you were able to handpick your team. This team building variety is one of the most player expression centric things in Xenoblade 2, and the limitation of the gacha system forces you to engage with it in earnest and find out just how rewarding putting together a good build is. Spoiler, it's incredibly rewarding. Still, I'd like to have a little power even though I'm not going to be sidequesting, and as such I actually do something I didn't do in my first playthrough. I use the expansion pass to get some resources. The expansion pass is what you get if you buy the game with the Tora expansion. Other than, well, the Tora expansion itself, it comes with a few new side quests, a couple new rare blades, and a bunch of random items that you can access at any time. I'll go into more detail on this expansion pass in another video, but I really don't like it. Still, I'm going to get all of the blade crystals in the pass and pull blades until I get a rare one to start building around. Due to systems that are too complicated to go into here, I am actually guaranteed a rare blade within my first 3 legendary core crystals, and I'm lucky enough to get it on the first go. Unfortunately, I'm lucky enough for it to be Electra, one of the worst rare blades in the game. Electra is a shield hammer blade, which is a tank class weapon. Shield hammers are undoubtedly the worst weapons in the game. They've got incredibly slow auto attacks, low damage, and usually pretty bad arts, which reload incredibly slowly due to these slow auto attacks. They don't even really work for tanking that well, because despite having high defense, their low damage output means they have a lot of trouble holding aggro. Electra is one of the better shield hammers, but that doesn't say much at all in a class as weak as this. She makes up for the weapon class's inability to hold aggro with her skill Zappy Girl, which passively increases her aggro every second by just existing. And she's more survivable than most shield hammers thanks to her skill Clangy Girl, which increases her user's block chance. Once she has aggro, her game plan is to maintain it and focus on trying to not die, because her skill Sparky Girl hits all enemies who damage her back with moderate ether damage, hopefully creating a passive source of damage for her. Unfortunately, this is just not a great game plan, since even with the counter damage, her DPS is lower than almost any other tank that isn't a shield hammer, and Clangy Girl is frankly overkill on a shield hammer, which shouldn't have trouble staying alive even without the increased block rate, making Clangy Girl mostly a wasted skill slot. She still has some trouble competing for aggro even with Zappy Girl, because most of her damage happens when she's already being targeted. There's very few non-shield hammer tank blades that aren't better than Electra, since they can simultaneously keep up aggro, be survivable, and do damage. Having her on Rex is even worse, since Rex's shield hammer set is especially awful, and his stats are geared to be a damage dealer. I don't see Electra being a permanent fixture on my team, but I'll equip her for a little while and see how she does. Okay, now that that's over, let's pick up the pace since there's some fluff here. We plan for the rescue mission, and Tor is still very earnest and likable as he reveals he's been working on building an artificial blade to make his lifelong dream of being a driver come true, even though he doesn't have the aptitude. This is the case of someone not dying from being rejected that I mentioned earlier, but it's implied that it's because he's a Nopon, who are rarely able to become drivers and thus seem to have a weaker reaction to core crystals in general. We help him build the artificial blade by going on a couple quick fetch quests for parts. On this one we go to Lashan Island and we have to dodge a bunch of enemies that are too strong for us to get to the weaker one in the middle of it all and kill it. It's a fun distraction and a pretty unique type of challenge. It's not something that the game asks a lot of you. It's also pleasantly tongue-in-cheek by making the guy scared of the weak and aggressive enemy in the middle of a bunch of aggressive strong ones. We then have to salvage a few parts for the blade, and I get thankfully lucky by getting it really quickly. Then we have the introduction of Poppi, the artificial blade. There's a good, very atmospheric Frankenstein homage, and then my goodwill for Tora's character fucking dies as the recurring joke that he's a pervert comes in. He's accidentally left Poppi in her fetish maid program, has made outfits for her in the closet, she looks like she's 12. It's fucking awful. This would be forgivable, and I wouldn't have made such a final statement on disliking Tora if there was ever more to him than this for the rest of the game, but there sort of just isn't. He's got a somewhat sizable non-perversion related character arc centered around him later in the game, in Chapter 4, but it's the absolute low point of the game's story, and then he just sort of disappears into the background, not doing anything in the plot and only showing up in heart-to-hearts, many of which involve him being a pervert. Look, I'm pretty unashamed. I like pervert characters in a lot of anime. I'm not going to shame anyone for liking pervy, horny shit, and I'm certainly not going to dislike a character for being a pervert. I unabashedly really like High School DxD, which is borderline just straight up porn. Issei, the protagonist, is one of my all-time favorite shonen protagonists, and the way he drives a lot of the plot is by being insatiably horny for every attractive female around him. But he's got other personality traits. He's a loyal friend, he has a sense of humor, he holds grudges, he's insecure about aspects of his personality, and he doesn't want to have sex with robots that he himself has designed to look like they're 12. In fact, he exclusively wants to have sex with consenting adults, like a good person should. Tora doesn't have any of this. Tora is an earnest shy inventor boy for all 3 cutscenes, and then he fades into the background as a non-character, only to occasionally be brought out to be horny. There's still good moments left in this character. I distinctly remember a few great heart-to-hearts he has, but I just don't like him overall. Outside those heart-to-hearts, at best I just sort of forget he exists, and at worst he's being disgusting and I want him off the screen so I can forget he exists. It's especially upsetting because Poppi is in strong contention for my favourite character in this game, and is responsible for 2 of the 4 times it made me cry, more than any other character. She's a sweetheart, and seeing her grow up and gain understanding of the world while slowly learning to feel is executed perfectly. She's definitely the character with the most defined arc in the game, and the person who grows the most. But she's introduced as a weird fanservice vehicle that put me off of her for chapters on end. She deserves so much better than this introduction. She's such a better character than you'd think of by looking at this. We're then introduced to Poppiswap and Tiger Tiger. Tora is a pretty unique playable character in that he can't have blades equipped other than Poppi, and Poppi being an artificial blade powers up differently from other blades. You can customize basically every aspect of her set, giving her unique skills, unique special effects, and even changing her element and class. Unfortunately, doing this requires special items and a currency called Ether Crystals, which you have to earn by playing this retro minigame called Tiger Tiger. It takes forever to outfit her with good stuff, and you'll be grinding Tiger Tiger for hours. Just to equip her with basic stuff, since Tora is going to be a required party member for a while, I spent a good 40 minutes grinding. I'll go into more detail later to keep this video a little less long, not gonna say short at this point, but it's a really cool system that unfortunately takes too much grinding in a minigame that I personally just really don't want to play, and it led me to not using Tora after he was required in my first playthrough, and frankly probably not in this one either, despite him being the undisputed strongest character in the game if you outfit him properly. A bunch of side quests have opened up. I'm not going to do all of them, but there's 2 I want to do. I want to point out the absurdity of this first though. Mia's about to get executed, we're in a rush to save her, but right now is when the game design encourages us to go take a bunch of detours on side quests. This will be a recurring problem throughout the game that I'll also explore in more detail later. Can you tell I'm trying to cut as much time as possible out of this video? The first side quest we'll do is Paying It Forward. It's basically an optional tutorial for the mechanic of shop deeds. If you buy all the items at a shop, they'll offer you the ability to buy the deed to the shop, which will give you small passive benefits in gameplay. It's a silly system, since that's not how buying shops works at all, and there's no good reason why owning a vegetable shop should give you a higher item collection radius, but it's fun enough. It's weird to give the tutorial here though, because almost every shop doesn't offer all its items until you raise your affinity with the area it's in, which takes a while, and so it won't be until the endgame that you start to be able to rack most of these deeds up. There's a couple that you can get in the mid-game, but you know. I also did the side quest The Case of the Crane. The Torigoth crane has been mysteriously broken, and it's up to you to figure out who did it and to help fix it. It's the first multi-part side quest. The objective here is to complete 2 other side quests, solving the case and fixing the crane. Figuring out who broke the crane is pretty fun. You run around town interrogating people, and it's a decently enjoyable light mystery thing. You're not expected to deduce anything yourself, but it's got a charming atmosphere to it, and it feels like you're doing things. You then fight the Trigon who did it, and they repent. It's charming, and it gives the world a bit of personality. Fixing the crane is a nightmare. You have to salvage 5 of a pretty rare item. Salvaging consists of walking up to a salvage point, doing a QTE, waiting for an animation to play, fighting an enemy, and then collecting some loot. It's completely up to luck if you get the thing you want. Salvaging quests were consistently my least favourite in the game, and this one took me distressingly long. I spent a long time just doing the same thing over and over again. It's not a great mechanic, and I sort of wish it wasn't in the game, or at least wasn't obligatory for side quests. Still, the side quest chain overall is oddly memorable for something so mundane, and it highlights the way that the game will consistently turn the mundane aspects of the characters' lives into side quests, which helps that lived-in feel that permeates all rest. You're often doing something trivial that feels like it would really happen in this world. After this, I move on with the story and go to the Titan Battleship that Nia is being held on. The party boards it from this route using Rex's anchor. It's used as comedy when he can't haul Pyra up and calls her heavy. Haha, you can't call a lady fat, Rex, but I want to highlight that it's established here that Poppi is strong and can effortlessly do it. The Titan Battleship is the second of the select few semi-linear dungeons in the game. It's mostly just a bunch of corridors with small offshoots for loot. Unless memory serves me wrong, these will completely disappear after this point until rearing their head exactly one more time way later in the game, so it's weird that the abandoned ship was used to tutorialize them back in Chapter 1. We fight through the battleship, rescue Dromark by having Pyra melt his door, notice these locked doors, rescue Nia, get a key, and we can go back to the locked doors to get some loot and fight this unique monster, Remorseful Vaclav. That's cool level design. It demands you remember things and it rewards you for thinking about the things you're getting. Remorseful Vaclav is the first cool fight of the game, requiring strategy and careful aggro management if you're playing Rex. This is the first time I pulled off a full blade combo as well, and accidentally a fusion combo, which the game hasn't taught us about. But I eventually managed to DPS Vaclav down. It's a satisfying battle. It's a bit weird that we're murdering this random remorseful prisoner, but hey, video games. I then remember that I meant to open crystals on Nia until I got a rare blade too, and 2 legendary crystals in, I opened Boreas. He's a bitball, a healer class weapon that usually focuses on healing through doing damage, and it's fortunate that I opened him on Nia since she's meant to be a designated healer and her bitball set is quite strong. Boreas is a bit of an oddball bitball in that his damage output is quite high and he's decently tanky to make up for the fact that this makes it likely he'll gain aggro. His skill, Look Out, increases his evasion rate by a very significant amount when he's at high affinity, which you want to be at anyway if possible, and if he does get hit, his other skill, Twang, gives him a good chance of inflicting knockback on the enemy, which will obviously knock them back, thus slowing down their next attack by a decent amount. If he's getting swarmed by enough small enemies that the tanks can't keep all of their attention and they're attacking enough to make it through Boreas' defensive skills, his third skill, Tasty Snack, heals the entire party for 40 to 60% of their max HP when Boreas kills an enemy, making him incredibly survivable and pretty handy to get kills with. I opened Boreas in the mid-game on my first playthrough, and he became a staple of my designated tank until near the endgame, since Boreas' survivability allowed them to be able to switch to him and heal if need be, while not taking too much of a defensive hit since they still had the aggro on them. It made them a little less dependent on designated healers. Nia's not too survivable, so opening Boreas might lead me into building her aggressively instead, so that she can take advantage of Boreas' high DPS and have less risk of dying if she does get the aggro. I'll have to see what else I open on her before deciding though. Oh, also, Boreas' design is bonkers. This is part of what I love about rare blades. Most of them are designed by guest artists who basically do whatever the hell they feel like doing with them. We fight through the battleship and we encounter the heart-to-heart tutorial. These are optional little voiced conversations between characters that add depth to the world. They're super cool, but this first one is just sort of whatever. It's just Rex geeking out about tech with Tora while Nia fails to get along with Poppi, at least on the route I picked. Eventually, we fight Dughall. He's meant to be evil for hiding behind his blade, but he sort of makes sense. We learn that blades are immortal when it comes to physical damage because they regenerate so fast, so it's sort of logical that they should be on the front line. The way the game makes Dughall look bad for this is Nia pointing out that blades feel pain too, and Dughall evilly laughs about not caring about Blade's feelings, which does make him a really bad person, but it doesn't address the point that he makes, that the drivers feel pain if they get hit just as much as blades do, the blade dies if the driver dies, and the driver can actually die in a fight as opposed to the blade. If two people would feel pain by getting hit, but one of them wouldn't die, it makes sense that the person who wouldn't die should be taking the hit. Especially if the only way the person who wouldn't die can die is through the person who would die dying. I wish there was better reasoning for why the driver should be taking the hits for the blade here, because as is, Dughall's actions seem to make more sense than the party's, though he's undoubtedly being an evil prick about it. Especially considering that later on in the game we learned that in the past blades did actually used to fight in the front line, and we never really get an explanation for why that changed. It's one of those things that you just sort of have to accept for the story to make sense, and which I wouldn't question if the game didn't draw attention to it here and explicitly show that the blade can fight in the front line just fine. I think the idea might be that drivers can end the fight faster than blades and are more effective at fighting, but even then the blade doing the fighting shouldn't be completely off the table for riskier encounters. We get a tutorial on how the aggro system works, which is fine, but it's way too late, since we've had Tora acting as a tank for several side quests and a full dungeon now. And we also get a tutorial on sealing, which is what happens at the end of blade combos. This tutorial goes into tons of details on sealing, which doesn't matter very often and is super self-explanatory. Anyone with a brain should instantly be able to figure it out by just looking at the combo tree. The tutorial then very briefly runs over blade combos putting elemental orbs on enemies. Orbs are one of the most important mechanics in the game, but the game barely explains them, tells you only their one slight downside, that they grant resistance to their element, and makes it look like you don't want to put them on enemies. After all, you don't want them resisting your attacks. Admittedly, you can't utilize their upside just yet, but this cements in your brain that putting orbs on enemies is bad, when actually it's one of the things you'll want to spend the most time trying to do once the game gives you all your tools. After Dughall, we run into Morag. This is a very badass intro scene. She claims that she wants Pyra to avoid her committing atrocities like what happened during the Aegis War 500 years ago. This is a cool name drop. It adds the mystery of why there was an Aegis War, but at the same time it explains that there was an Aegis War without ever explicitly telling you. It's simultaneous world building and mystery building. At the same time, it puts a slight bit of distrust towards Pyra in the Odyssey's brain. She was acting weirdly cagey in that dinner scene earlier. As we fight Morag, we get a good tutorial for level 4 specials. Her fight's a little tedious. She has tons of health, but she dishes out pretty low damage, meaning you just sort of wail on her without a tiny bit of threat. Dughall was honestly a harder fight. She eventually goes down in the fight, and then Rex is losing in the cutscene. Again. This one's forgivable to me because this is the most iconic action cutscene of the game in my head. Counterattack is a song that plays during a lot of turning the battle around type scenes, and which I positively spoke about at the end of chapter 1. But this is where it fits the best in the entire game, I think. As Rex's power level rises, his victories will be more and more about powering up in the middle of a fight and then hitting things really hard, which does fit counterattack really well, but he's at his weakest since getting Pyra, and he's forced to fight creatively. Throughout the chapter, we've been seeing small little elements that naturally came up in other scenes that were secretly set up for this battle. Rex uses his grappling hook, which we saw used for a similar thing boarding the battleship, to pull out a water tower. Poppi, whose strength was established during that same scene, is the one who's able to put enough strength into it. Rex uses the way Pyra's flames can be reflected, as seen in the Bridget solo fight, and the way they can burn through metal, as set up in the scene where they burn through Gormott's cell door, to melt the feet of the water tower, allowing Poppi to tip it over and send water flying everywhere, extinguishing Bridget's flames the same way Tora did in the alleyway fight, and giving the party the opportunity to escape. It's outrageously smooth setup and payoff, and the entire time Rex is executing his plan, it feels like he's being completely dominated by Morag and Bridget's sheer power and skill, making this a very satisfying underdog escaping from the powerful villain type moment. It showcases Rex's craftiness and intelligence, beating Morag in a way that's not a straight up fight. Counterattack is perfectly matched with the beats of the fight, shifting perfectly as the mood and balance of power changes. It's to the point where I wouldn't be surprised to learn counterattack was composed with this scene in mind and just reused throughout the game because it's so good, or at the very least the scene was animated to match up with the momentum of counterattack specifically in a way other scenes weren't. It's a truly phenomenal battle scene, and it's one of the few where it's justified as a cutscene in my head, since this couldn't have been done in gameplay. It's brilliant and it's memorable, despite not mattering that much in the grand scope of things. After this, we're finally at the home stretch. The fugitives stop for a while, and Nia's about to leave to go join up with Tora, but Rex is so honest and naive that she can't help but feel charmed by him and his naive belief in Elysium, and she decides to stick it out with him. What Rex says here is sort of a mission statement, putting emphasis on his worries for the world at large and his promise to Pyra in particular. He's aware he's too weak to protect her, but he's determined anyway, seeing her as a person and not a weapon to fight in the inevitable war that's coming, as the Titans are dying off. I think this specifically really gets to Nia and convinces her Rex may be worth sticking around with, as we'll learn as we get to know her better. The way this set of core objectives shifts will be the backbone of Rex's character growth. Right now, he just wants to find Elysium to try and bring about a utopia on Earth to avoid the coming land wars, and he wants to defend Pyra. Then there's this wholesome little scene with Pyra and Rex, which doesn't really amount to much, but which is beautiful, and it works really well in the moment. The fire looks pretty. There's this great shot of Nia, which lives rent-free in my mind. This is also the first explicit moment of Rex being way into Pyra, as he has this corny little line about the things she makes being beautiful, which he then gets embarrassed about. And then we finally roll credits, or I guess chapter break thing. I'm so glad I can stop writing about this chapter. It's good, but Jesus Christ, it's long to write about. Chapter 2 is better than Chapter 1, but it's still a rough patch. It feels incredibly stop and start. The amount of tutorials is frankly exhausting and confusing on a first playthrough, and for what should be a simple plot, where Nia gets captured, then Rex meets Tora and rescues her, it feels drawn out and full of tangents. It also has 3 of the game's absolute lowlights in it. Gramps' fake out death the first time you try playing as Nia, and the garbage fire introduction Poppi gets. Still, a lot of the awkwardness is set up for stuff we'll use later, and the game is much smoother sailing from now on thanks to that groundwork being laid. We now know the basics of blades, we have Tora and Poppi in the party, and Morag and Morardain are forces we're aware of now. On top of that, the combat has actually gotten bearable and occasionally enjoyable, though we're still missing several of the key mechanics that make it truly fantastic. Most importantly, the open world is now open, and we can experience the joy of Xenoblade's exploration and fantastic views, even if I'm not really doing that on this playthrough. Next up is Chapter 3, Our Own War, which will hopefully be less dense than this one with things for me to talk about, so that I can fit some of the miscellanea I've been holding back on, while keeping the video shorter and sweeter than this one. Can you believe that the idea was that these would be shorter videos I can bang out in a few days?